Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another video in my history series, where today I'm going to be sharing the story of Bonnie and Clyde. Sometimes I like to share the more obscure stories from history, and sometimes I like to teach myself and you guys about something that maybe everyone's heard of, but the details are a little bit iffy. Basically, this series is you getting to learn about something that I decided to nerd out on that particular week. And this week I wanted to know, what's the deal with Bonnie and Clyde? They were an American criminal duo who committed crimes throughout the country during the Great Depression. There was a lot of crime throughout the USA at this time. People across the country were desperately poor and starving. This was a time where the average person lived in poverty, and criminals became somewhat of the biggest celebrities of the time. The authorities, the police, the government, the banks, they were the bad guys in the eyes of so many people. The criminals were the ones fighting back at a system that made parents have to choose between feeding themselves and feeding their children that one slice of bread they have. People felt they could relate with the criminals more than the authorities at this time. The people were desperate, and the criminals, the gangsters, just had the balls to do something about it. And the story of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow really caught the attention of the American public at the time, because not only were they these glorified criminals, but they also had this element of romance that people loved so much. Entertainment was very sparse in these times. For many following the story of Bonnie and Clyde in each day's paper, that was the highlight of their day. People actually found themselves rooting for Bonnie and Clyde. The press would cover in detail what they'd been up to each day, followed the police chasing them across the states. But before we get into this video, I want to take a moment to share with you It Takes a Killer, a true crime documentary that will air on CBS Reality. It Takes a Killer looks into the minds of some of the world's most notorious murderers and uncovers the motives behind their crimes. In each episode, experts from the FBI, Scotland Yard and other leading homicide investigators talk us through the forensic details of each murder scene. They profile the killer's behaviour and analyse the crime scene evidence. Some episodes focus on high-profile cases that you might have heard of before, taking a deep dive into the crimes. Others will likely feature obscure cases that you've never heard of before. It Takes a Killer is airing on CBS Reality on weeknights at 9 PM and 9:30 PM throughout August. You can watch CBS Reality on Sky, Freeview, Virgin and Freesat. So Bonnie Parker was born on October 1st, 1910 in Rowena, Texas, as the daughter of Emma and Charles Parker. Her father was a bricklayer who died when Bonnie was just 4 years old, leaving her widowed mother to provide for the family. Emma, who was a seamstress, made the choice to move the family back to her parents' home in Cement City in West Dallas, so named because it was created to support workers in the cement plants operated in the area. In high school, Bonnie meets Roy Thornton, who was 2 years her senior, and they soon drop out to get married, marrying on September 25th, 1926, just a number of days before Bonnie turned 16. They move in together a couple of blocks away from Bonnie's mother, but she ends up missing her mum so much that she moves back in with her. Bonnie was little more than a child at this time, married but still needing the help and support of her mum. As you can probably guess, the marriage didn't end up lasting very long. Roy started his foray into the criminal world at a very young age. He would frequently leave the home and not come back for several days, and he beat Bonnie on a regular basis. They separated several times over the course of the year they were married and ended up splitting for good in December 1927 due to Roy's alleged infidelity. Despite the split, they never actually divorced, and Bonnie wore her wedding ring until the day she died. Roy would spend the rest of his life in and out of prison for his criminal ways and would end up dying in a prison escape attempt many years later. Clyde Barrow was born on the 24th of March 1909 in Tellico, Texas, the fifth of 7 children born into a very poor farming family. Eventually, after the family farm failed due to drought, the family moved to the outskirts of Dallas, Texas. Clyde was said to be quite a quiet and unassuming boy as a child, with ambitions to become a musician. But him and his family lived in unimaginable poverty, the poorest a person could possibly be. Hunger was the usual for the Barrow family, and Clyde was determined to fight his way out of this. He just wanted to feel like he was doing something. He fell into a life of crime under the influence of his older brother Buck. Buck taught teenage Clyde everything he knew, and by the age of 17, Clyde had found his niche in the crime world: car theft. The newest cars at the time ran on electric starter systems, which were very easy to hotwire if you knew how, and Clyde, it turned out, was a natural. One night, Clyde and Buck stole a car and rode around town before deciding to rob a shop on Main Street. Buck got caught whilst Clyde escaped, and Buck ended up being sentenced to several years in prison for the crime. You'd think for most people this would be enough to put them off a life of crime, but not for Clyde. He returned to rob another store the very next night. Perhaps it was the adrenaline that did it for him, that thrill of the steal, but the Great Depression made it even more difficult than usual to fight your way out of a life of poverty. It wasn't just a case of work your way up and out, it just wasn't an option at this time. If you were poor, you were poor. There was nothing you could really do about it. Both Bonnie and Clyde were the kind of people who wanted more out of life than the cards they'd been dealt. Bonnie had ambitions of being famous one day. She was this tiny little thing. She was 4'11", 90 pounds, a part-time waitress and amateur poet. And she loved going to the movies. All she ever wanted to be was one of the girls in the motion pictures that she loved so much. The movies were an escape for her. Clyde was a very scrawny 5'6". He never weighed more than 130 pounds, but he was incredibly good looking. He was fast talking and charming, and he hated living in poverty. He wanted to make a name for himself. It was almost an act of fate when the two ended up meeting in Texas on the 5th of January 1930. Although it doesn't seem like anybody is 100% sure of how they met, the story goes that Bonnie was a friend of Clyde's sister, and when Clyde came home one night he found Bonnie making hot chocolate in the kitchen. Reports say that they were immediately besotted with each other and they spent all night talking, and they became inseparable from that point onwards. Other sources say that it wasn't Clyde's sister at all that introduced them and it was actually mutual friends, but I suppose it's not too important. They met. 20-year-old Clyde was just what 19-year-old Bonnie needed to forget about her now incarcerated ex-husband. It was said that the connection between the two was so strong they could almost see the sparks flying between them. But not long after they met, Clyde was arrested for burglary. Clearly Bonnie had a type. He was sent to the county jail in April 1930, now 21 years old, to await his trial, but he soon broke out after he asked Bonnie to smuggle him a gun into the jail. He knew where one was that she could get hold of. All she had to do was put it under her dress and bring it to him. He even drew her a map. It seems like this is the one decision that determined the path of Bonnie's life from here on out. If she had said no to this, maybe I wouldn't be here now to tell you this story. But of course, she did do it, and Clyde and a number of other prisoners managed to escape. They were all captured and carted back to jail just 1 week later though, and it's at this point that he's sent to spend his time at Eastham Prison Farm to do 14 years of hard labour. Needless to say, Clyde did not have a good time at Eastham. Prisons were not for rehabilitation, prisons were for punishment, I suppose very similar to now still. Clyde was to be punished for his crimes. He was sent to the prison containing the worst possible serious offenders, and at this time Clyde was nothing more than a petty criminal in comparison. Once at Eastham, he was repeatedly sexually assaulted by a man called Ed Crowder. He was 6 foot tall and over 200 pounds, easily overpowering 5'6" Clyde. He was raped for months on end before one day he lost his temper and ended up killing his tormentor. This is thought to be the first time he ever murdered. He lured Ed into a corner of the prison, knowing that he would follow him, and he attacked. As you can imagine, this whole situation probably would have been quite bad for Clyde, who was already doing 14 years, but another prisoner ended up taking the fall for the murder, confessing to it. This other prisoner was already spending a life sentence in prison, and Clyde was young. Maybe the other prisoner knew about the sexual abuse that Clyde had been dealing with, or maybe he thought that he was still young and had a whole life ahead of him and thought, why not, I'm going to die in prison anyway. So he took the fall. During this time in prison, Clyde's only respite was waiting for the mail. He would receive letters from Bonnie almost every day. She encouraged him to stay strong. She spoke of her deep love for him. And this was his motivation to get out of jail, a life with Bonnie Parker. Life at Eastham was very difficult. It consisted of hours of gruelling manual labour every single day, and Clyde just wasn't about that life. So in late January 1932, he concocts a plan to cut off his big toe and part of another toe in an accident. He basically gets another prisoner to cut off his toes with an axe, hoping that if he couldn't do the work, he'd get freed on parole. But unbeknownst to him, his mother had actually successfully petitioned the judge for his release based on his good behaviour, and Clyde ended up being released anyway just 6 days later. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life and apparently was never able to drive whilst wearing shoes again. Clyde changed during his time at Eastham. He went from a rebellious boy, a rebellious teenager, to a hardened criminal. Lots of people who knew him said that he was never the same again. Upon his release, the love affair between Clyde and Bonnie just seemed to intensify. They reunite and Clyde makes a very brief effort to go straight, but soon realises that being a criminal is just easier. He gives up and forms a criminal gang, taking Bonnie along with him on his missions. Together they would rob and shoot their way around Dallas, burgling various small businesses and banks, with the police never quite being able to catch them. Until one day, Bonnie was caught after a botched robbery attempt, whilst Clyde managed to escape. She spent a short amount of time in jail before a grand jury decided to free her. They just didn't believe that any woman would choose to join criminals of her own volition, and therefore she must be innocent. Sexism, it works both ways. But of course, once released from jail, Bonnie very much did choose to join Clyde. But it wasn't just Bonnie and Clyde, they were part of a gang of criminals, infamously named the Barrow Gang. Clyde was the leader. Other members over the years included Buck Barrow, his older brother, and Buck's wife, Blanche, W.D. Jones, Henry Methvin, Raymond Hamilton, Joe Palmer, Ralph Fultz, and S.J. Watley. On one occasion, Clyde and Ray Hamilton decide to rob a local grocery store, a crime in which the grocery store owner was shot and killed. The wife of the man who was murdered was able to identify both Clyde and Ray as being involved in this. And then in the August, Clyde barely escaped during one police ambush in Oklahoma, where he killed a sheriff's deputy in the process. Clyde and some accomplices were drinking moonshine in the car park of a country dance when officers approached them. And this was when Prohibition was still very much a thing in Oklahoma. Now the murderer of a police officer, Bonnie and Clyde were now forced to begin their life on the road, with Clyde a very much wanted man. Soon, news of their crimes began to hit the local papers, who traced them as they travelled over state lines. The police pursued them across Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Louisiana, Arkansas, Kansas, Iowa, and Illinois. Another man was killed by the gang on Christmas Day, shot in front of his own family when he tried to stop Clyde from stealing his car. According to family members, Clyde always felt guilty when he murdered someone, but he didn't ever want to go back to prison. He particularly wouldn't bat an eyelid over killing a police officer. He would do whatever it took to never have to go back to prison, except stop being a criminal apparently. But by this point, Clyde was already a known criminal. He was a known murderer. There were multiple warrants out for his arrest. Even if he stopped committing crime there and then, they still would have come for him and sent him back to prison, which was literally his worst nightmare. So Clyde had to keep running, he had to keep moving. Across states they would rob gas stations, banks and grocery stores, never stealing huge amounts of money but just enough to get them to safety over the county line. There's a big idea that Bonnie and Clyde loved to rob a bank, but in reality that wasn't really the case. Clyde, as we know, had a proclivity for cars, constantly stealing the best, most powerful models whenever he came across them. This meant that the cars that he drove always outpaced the cheaper models that the police drove, so it was always an easy escape for him. And if it wasn't an easy escape, the guns he had were also much more powerful than the pistols that the police had. He was always better than the police, and this made the authorities even more determined to catch him. Bonnie, it seems, was an afterthought for many. A lot of people thought of her as this damsel in distress kind of figure, a young girl led off the beaten path by falling in love with the wrong guy. Her family would constantly beg her to leave Clyde, because the two would always go back to visit their families despite the circumstances they were in, despite police chasing them across state lines. They would always make time to go and see their families. Even Clyde apparently would tell Bonnie to leave him, but she always refused. She was a woman who knew her own mind, she knew what she was doing, and she knew that she wanted to be there. At least that was the general consensus surrounding Bonnie Parker until the events of April 13th, 1933. The gang had a temporary hideout, an apartment in Joplin, Missouri, which members would just come and go from as they pleased. The group would drink alcohol and play loud card games into the night. They weren't exactly hiding in this hideout. They made it very obvious there were a lot of people there. One neighbour reported this very noisy house to the Joplin Police Department, who got ready to go to the house where they suspected bootleggers may have been living, bootleggers making illegal alcohol basically. But of course it wasn't just some little bootleggers, it was the Barrow Gang, infamous Barrow Gang. When the officers arrived, Clyde, Buck and W.D. Jones opened fire on the officers, fatally wounding 2 of them. The gang were forced to escape, having to leave everything behind at the apartment, including papers that identified them, a large arsenal of weapons, and a camera with several rolls of undeveloped film. The police developed the film on this camera and it found the now infamous photos of Bonnie and Clyde posing. Bonnie holding Clyde at gunpoint, couples photos of the two kissing and embracing, and the famous photos of little Bonnie Parker, cigar in her teeth, pistol in her hand, and leaning up against a stolen vehicle. This is a time in which women are supposed to be submissive, stay out of the men's way, do their housework, feed their families, and through this one single photo of Bonnie Parker was the antithesis of that. The photos and poems of Bonnie's that had been left behind soon became front page news across America. She became somewhat of a celebrity and people were thrilled by this apparent romance between Bonnie and Clyde. Overnight they became household names across the country, not just in the states in which they'd been committing their crimes now, across the entirety of the USA. Bonnie finally got what she wanted, I suppose. This legend was born. But it actually made what they were trying to do, crime, even harder. It brought too much attention to them and they had to be on the move constantly, country road after country road. Now their photos and their crimes had been splashed across the papers countrywide, they were going to get recognised wherever they went. They just had to try and stay alive from this point. There wasn't any time for actually living. It was around this time, in May 1933, that the FBI finally joined the local police in the chase. Until that point, they'd lacked jurisdiction to get involved, but they managed to gather evidence that a stolen car had been driven by the pair across state lines, which was a federal offence. Bonnie and Clyde were now facing federal interstate car theft charges. FBI agents got to work distributing notices of fingerprints, photographs and descriptions of the couple and their crimes. They began to trail them across the state lines and discovered who their accomplices were, but it would still be a number of months before they would actually get caught. Clyde would eventually feature on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. In the June of that year, disaster occurred when Clyde's impeccable driving skills finally failed him. He was driving with Jones and Bonnie near Wellington, Texas, when the car flipped into a ravine. Jones and Clyde managed to escape the car, but Bonnie was trapped underneath. Eventually, Clyde managed to free her with the help of a local family, but her leg was incredibly burned. They weren't sure that she would even survive her injuries, but upon treatment from the family with baking soda and grease, they managed to salvage her leg. Reports say the burn was so bad that her skin was gone. You could see her bones at points. When the police arrived at the scene to help, not knowing there was the infamous Bonnie and Clyde, Clyde kidnapped the two officers and drove 50 miles away before releasing them, leaving them handcuffed to a tree. The gang had to lay low in Arkansas for a while whilst they nursed Bonnie back to health, but eventually they had to flee when Buck and Jones bungled a robbery and murdered yet another person. Now Clyde could easily have dropped Bonnie off at a hospital or back home with her family and gone his way. She was only going to slow him down from there on out. It was clear that her injuries would never heal entirely and she would never be able to walk properly again. But he didn't abandon her. You can say what you want about Bonnie and Clyde, but you can't doubt that level of love, their dedication to one another. Knowing that the gang was potentially now compromised, the police knew this was their time to up their firepower. If they wanted to apprehend these criminals, they had to match them. In July 1933, the gang checked into the Red Crown Tourist Court, where their conspicuous behaviour would draw police attention. Clyde went into town to purchase medication to treat Bonnie's leg, and the pharmacist soon contacted the police. He'd been asked by them to keep an eye out for anyone buying these kinds of items. At 11 PM that night, the officers headed towards the cabin where the gang was staying with submachine guns. But the Barra gang's guns were still more powerful. They escaped once more. Buck and Blanche were both pretty seriously injured though, which was just more people that had to be given medical attention. The gang ended up camping at a local abandoned fairground where they attempted to care for Buck's wounds. They were so bad that his skull had been shattered, leaving his brain exposed. The locals noticed and police officers were called once again, and they opened fire once again. All the local people turned up to spectate. There was a crowd of about 100 people that turned up to see the Barra gang get finally apprehended. Bonnie, Clyde and Jones all managed to escape, with Clyde actually carrying Bonnie through the woods, whilst Buck and Blanche were captured, unable to keep up with their injuries. Buck would die in hospital 5 days later, whilst Blanche went to prison. So back to the road they went, with their gang numbers seriously dwindling. They needed more power if they're going to stay alive. And that's all this was really. It was a fight to stay alive, no matter what it takes. Clyde was not going back to prison. So in January 1934, they orchestrated the Eastern Breakout, a prison breakout, successfully freeing 5 felons, including Henry Methvin and Raymond Hamilton. A prison guard was actually shot and killed during the escape, and this very much angered the prison chief, Lee Simmons. And this breakout was the beginning of the end for Bonnie and Clyde. This angered the state of Texas, so now they had the full power of Texas and the FBI behind the manhunt for them. And it was getting harder and harder to stay elusive when they're in the papers every single day. Lee Simmons promised that every single person involved in the prison breakout would be hunted down and killed. And they were, except for Henry Methvin for reasons that will soon become apparent. Simmons decided to contact the former Texas Ranger, Captain Frank Hamer, and persuaded him to help him hunt down the Barrow Gang. Although Hamer was retired, he still had the power to get things done, and this wasn't a man who was scared to do what he had to do to bring justice. He killed over 50 men during his time as captain. Hamer put out the order. Bonnie and Clyde were not to be captured, they were to be executed on sight, and he set us off on his own journey, shadowing Bonnie and Clyde as they travelled, never too far behind. They left a trail of crime everywhere they went, death and destruction. On April 1st, 1934, Bonnie, Clyde and Henry Methvin, who was travelling with them at the time, encountered 2 young highway patrolmen near Grapevine, Texas. The group decided to mess with them. Some think that Clyde just intended to kidnap the officers. That was a favourite pastime of his. He loved to kidnap police officers and then handcuff them to trees apparently. But Henry opened fire and both officers were murdered for seemingly very little reason. Before this, every time an officer was murdered, it was because it was a case of murder or I get captured. But now this seemed just to be for fun. On April 6th, another constable was murdered by Bonnie and Clyde, who the very same day abducted a police chief. Many people speculate that the reason for all of this crime, became something other than a desperate claw at poverty. It's very possible that Clyde was just trying to get his own back on the Texas police and prison system, make them pay for the hell he went through whilst East in prison. But by this point in their journey, it seems that both Bonnie and Clyde knew they were reaching the end of the road. They knew they were likely going to die very, very soon. They had a final rendezvous with their families where they seemingly said their goodbyes. This is when Bonnie handed over her famous poem, The End of the Line, to her family. So enter the Methvin family. Their son, Henry, was one of the fugitives who escaped from Eastern prison in the breakout and was travelling now with Bonnie and Clyde. And the Methvins wanted clemency for their son. The FBI had been made aware of the family and learned that Bonnie and Clyde had made visits to the family home accompanied by Henry. They'd been travelling back and forth from Texas to Louisiana. So the FBI and local law enforcement in the area, including Frank Hamer, concentrated in on this area. They learned that Bonnie and Clyde and some of the Methvin family had held a party at Black Lake, Louisiana on the night of May 21st, and they had plans to return to the Methvin family home just a couple of days later. There was only one road that led to the Methvin house, and law enforcement hid in the bushes down the side of the road, just waiting for Bonnie and Clyde to make their way past. They knew that at some point they would be coming back to the house. The police waited there for a couple of days on a highway near Sales, Louisiana. It was kind of just a shot in the dark. There were rumours that Bonnie and Clyde would be heading back to the house, but they didn't know for certain. Of course, their plans could change at any time, but they thought they would just wait and see. Chances were that Clyde would speed past this road in his latest new model stolen car, so the officers knew they needed a way to ensure that Clyde slowed down. Now, despite what you'd probably think of old cars from the 30s, they would often actually reach speeds of up to 90 miles per hour. They tasked Ivan Methvin, Henry's father, with the job of pretending his truck had broken down on the side of the road in an attempt to get Clyde to slow down and help him. It was 9:15 AM on the 23rd of May 1934 when they heard the sound of a car speeding down the road, a Ford V8. As expected, it was Bonnie and Clyde returning to the Methvin house. Clyde took the bait, slowing down to help Ivan with his flat tyre, and without a second's thought, one of the posse hidden in the bushes, Prentice Oakley, fired a shot straight into Clyde's head. He died instantly and the car drove into a ditch. At that point, everyone unloaded their guns, 6 people firing directly into the car, Bonnie screaming. It lasted only seconds, in which time 150 bullets hit the car. Their bodies were decimated with no chance of survival. The officers weren't about to take any chances. Bonnie and Clyde had survived multiple bullet wounds over the years. They seemed to be indestructible, but now they were dead. And so ends the story of Bonnie and Clyde, over in a number of seconds. Locals heard what had happened and turned up at the scene before the bodies had even been removed, looting whatever they could from the cars as souvenirs. One man even brought a knife and tried to cut off Clyde's trigger finger to take with him. Most other people just went for things like the shell casings and bloody pieces of clothing though. The posse of officers never received their promised bounty on the capture of Bonnie and Clyde, so they were told to take whatever they could or whatever they wanted from the car. Items which were of little value at the time but I'm sure were now worth insane amounts of money. Soon the officers got control of the scene and the car with the bodies still inside is towed to a funeral parlour in town where their families are told of their demise. Bonnie and Clyde had requested to be buried side by side but the Parker family did not allow this. They believed their daughter had been led astray by Clyde, and so they're buried in their family plots in separate cemeteries. Their funerals held on May 26th. Flowers came in from across the country, including from some huge name gangsters. The largest floral tribute was sent by Dallas City newsboys. The story of Bonnie and Clyde had basically given them their jobs. People bought so many newspapers just to follow their stories. The story of Bonnie and Clyde's death sold 500,000 papers in Dallas alone. The tale of Bonnie and Clyde came at the perfect time for America. In a time when there was no entertainment to be had, people couldn't afford entertainment. The poor would scrape together their pennies to buy the paper to follow the story of Bonnie and Clyde, these star-crossed lovers. They did things that most people wouldn't dare to even dream of. They dared to try and dig their way out of poverty in a time when it was impossible to do so. Even if that wasn't their intention, that's how people saw them. The regular person didn't want to be a criminal, of course, but it was just this fascinating story. It was something to live vicariously through. A decade later, or a decade earlier, Bonnie and Clyde's story would have barely gained traction, just a couple of petty criminals. Their crimes came at the perfect time. Newspapers were just glad to have something to talk about other than the bleakness of the economy. But also, had it just been Clyde or the male apprentice, it probably wouldn't have caught any attention. The fact that it was Bonnie and Clyde, this glamorous, forbidden romance, people were drawn to it. She was just this normal girl living this very extraordinary life, and the same with Clyde, this normal guy who ended up on the wrong side of the tracks. The conditions of America at the time just blew their story up. It was this perfect melting pot, and over the years, their story has become legend. Thank you so much for watching this video, and a huge thank you to CBS Reality for sponsoring. As a girl from England, the story of Bonnie and Clyde isn't something that I particularly knew much about, so I'm really glad that I took the time to educate myself and educate you, because that's what I do here on the internet. Thank you for watching. Let me know what other historical stories you want to see me talk about in the comments down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.